Rodakovy isn't a name you'd expect in the headlines. A small rail station in occupied Luhansk, a dot most maps don't even bother to label. On the night of June 7th, its electrical substation was burning. At first glance, a local fire, a footnote in a long war, but Russian supply flows through that exact point fuel ammunition the weight of an entire stretch of front. And that night, Rodakovy didn't burn alone. 26 targets were hit almost at the same time, spread across 4 occupied regions. What looks like a string of random fires was in truth a single, coldly planned strike. And it wasn't aimed at tanks or soldiers, it was aimed at something far harder to replace. What that is, and why a handful of burning junctions can bring an entire war machine to a stall, is what we're about to take apart. To understand what happened that night, we need to step back and look at the map. The occupied territories in Ukraine's East Luhansk, Donetsk, and the Crimean Peninsula to the south aren't one connected empire. They're a patchwork of front lines, supply routes, and junctions held together by a single, unremarkable spine, the railway. Whoever controls that spine controls the war in the east. Whoever strikes it strikes everything resting on top of it. Russia's army is a railway army. That's not an insult. It's a sober description. Since Soviet days, Moscow's entire military mind has been built on rails. Artillery shells by the tens of thousands fuel in enormous volumes tanks, spare parts. Whole battalions, all of it moves cheapest and fastest by rail. A single freight train replaces hundreds of trucks. As long as the trains roll, Russia can play its sheer mass, more guns, more shells, more pressure day after day. That mass is Russia's greatest strength, and it hangs by thin threads. Consider the scale. An army this size burns through thousands of shells a day on an active stretch of front, plus fuel in quantities no truck convoy can carry alone. Moscow keeps the exact figures secret, but the principle isn't in dispute without the constant flow over rail. Firepower fades. In days, not weeks. Rail isn't a comfort, it's life support. And that dependence has a flip side that runs deeper than ammunition. Rails don't just move shells, they move men. Whole units, reserves, reinforcements roll to the front over the same tracks. Russia's ability to shift troops between sectors at scale rests on this network. When a central junction goes down, Moscow doesn't just lose a day of supply. For a while, it loses the mobility that turns its numerical edge into actual striking power in the first place. That's the real lever this night was reaching for. Because a rail network isn't equally strong everywhere. It lives by its nodes, the transshipment yards where freight is unloaded, sorted and pushed onto the last leg toward the front. Rodakovy is one such node. Kistiakovy in Donetsk is another. They're the joints of the spine, and like any joint, they're vulnerable. Destroy a single train, and Russia sends a new one the next day. Paralyze a node, and the backlog stretches all the way into the deep rear. And nowhere is this spine as fragile as in the south. Crimea hangs off the mainland by a few lifelines, the Kerch Bridge and a narrow land corridor through which both rail and road run. Everything that supplies the peninsula and the southern front has to pass through that needle's eye. What's a sprawling web elsewhere shrinks here to a handful of lines, and the fewer the lines, the more every single node matters. There's a second thread most people overlook: electricity. Large stretches of this network are electrified. They don't run on diesel, but on overhead lines fed by substations and power plants. One of them is the Zuivska thermal power plant near the town of Zuris, east of Donetsk. A facility under Russian control since 2014 that powers not just households, but the region's infrastructure. When the power drops, the electric locomotives stand still. Rail and power grid aren't separate problems in this region. They're the same nervous system, just touchable at two different points. For years, Ukraine tried to hit that nervous system. A station here, a depot there, isolated pinpricks that Russia quickly stitched back up. On the night of June 7th, something was different. It was no longer a pinprick. It was a coordinated grip on the entire web carried out by a force that in this form didn't even exist a few years ago. To understand why that weighs so heavily, we first have to lay out soberly what actually happened that night. Let's start with what's confirmed. According to Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, known by the abbreviation SBS, the branch carried out a large-scale drone operation on the night of June 7th, 2026, against 26 military energy and logistics targets. The force's commander, Colonel Robert Brovdi, call sign Magyar, personally claimed responsibility in an official operational brief. The targets were spread across occupied Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Crimea, and reached as far as the Bryansk region inside Russia. A word about the force itself, because that's where the real novelty lies. The SBS is no longer a loose collection of drone pilots. Ukraine has built it into a standalone military branch alongside the Army, Air Force, and Navy, a fourth pillar dedicated entirely to unmanned systems. That sounds like bureaucracy, but it's a turning point. A branch of its own means its own planning, its own reconnaissance, its own chain of command. Only that makes a coordinated strike on 26 targets in a single night possible at all. What used to be piecemeal is now staff work. At the center stood the rails. According to the independent telegram channel Exila Nova Plus, reporting that Western outlets like the Kiev Independent could not immediately verify on their own, a railway substation near Rodakovy in Luhansk caught fire. Near Chistyakove in Donetsk, a fire broke out at another rail facility. And at the thermal plant near Zuris, drones struck as well. I'll say it plainly because it matters. These details come from on-the-ground and social media monitoring, not from official confirmation. We treat them as what they are, credible but not yet verified. Other things are more firmly documented. Drone impacts reportedly damaged 3 locomotives and 2 rail couplings loaded with military fuel. Power distribution was crippled by targeted hits on 4 separate electrical substations. Across occupied Luhansk, loitering munitions drones that circle above the target before they strike hit substations and rail junctions and triggered localized fires. One number is deliberately missing from all this. How many drones the SBS actually launched for these 26 targets is an open question. Moscow tends to cite high interception counts in such cases. Kyiv stays quiet on the figure. Anyone selling you an exact swarm size is guessing. We won't. The most visible blow landed on Crimea. There, the target was the Semikholodiazyanka fuel depot in the village of Yedikuyu, formerly Lenin in the Kerch district. Satellite imagery quickly confirmed a massive fire at the site after multiple drone detonations. The depot is no sideshow, a Soviet-era facility brought back into operation in 2015, run by a Russian company to feed the fuel needs of the occupying forces. And the pattern of the targets gives away the intent. It didn't strike at random, but in 3 layers, rail junctions for movement substations and a power plant for the electricity that drives that movement, and fuel depots for what ultimately gets burned. Movement energy fuel the 3 pillars of any logistics attacked in one night all at once. How severe the damage to each individual site truly is can't be settled from a distance. Smoke on a satellite image is not yet a balance sheet, but the choice of targets is a statement in itself. This night didn't stand alone. It followed directly on a deep strike from June 6th, in which Ukrainian special forces, together with the SBS, hit the base of Russia's Baltic Fleet at Kronstadt near St. Petersburg across a distance of roughly 1,000 kilometers. And it fits a larger pattern. In late May, Ukraine's defense minister announced a program he called a logistical lockdown, deliberately intensifying strikes on Russia's rear to make active assault operations harder from the outset. The night of June 7th wasn't an outlier. It was the method in its purest form. Now to the core. Why does a strike like this even work? Most people picture air defense as a duel, a drone comes, a missile goes up hit. That's not how it works. Air defense is in truth a math problem. Every radar has a limited bandwidth. It can only detect, classify, sort by threat, and assign to an interceptor a certain number of targets at once. That's not a question of courage or equipment. It's a question of capacity of the radar screens, the operators, the decision chain behind them. Send one target and the system works calmly. Send 2. 5. Send dozens all at once spread across a wide arc, some of them cheap decoys, others real warheads, and the chain starts to stall. Which target first? Which is a dummy, which carries a charge? Where do you steer the few expensive interceptors? In that exact second of hesitation, the important drones slip through. That's the art the SBS put on display that night. It's called saturation. You don't overload the enemy's armor, you overload his attention. Mass isn't the means to do more damage. Mass is the means to get the few decisive hits through in the first place. And here, the math tips in Ukraine's favor. An attack drone costs a fraction of what a modern interceptor missile costs. Russia can't answer every cheap drone with an expensive missile. The magazines would be empty in minutes, the budget in weeks. Whoever forces the expensive to react to the cheap wins a little more with every passing night. Picture it like a telephone exchange. One call, no problem. But when hundreds call in the same second, it isn't the line that breaks, it's the switchboard. No one gets put through anymore. That's exactly what happens to an air defense under saturation. The expensive systems, the long-range radars, the interceptor batteries aren't destroyed. They're just overwhelmed for a moment. And a moment is enough. On top of that, modern air defense is built in layers, long-range systems for high, fast targets, shorter ones for low, slow ones. But drones fly low, slow, and in swarms. They force the expensive layers to deal with cheap targets, or they slip under them. Saturation doesn't attack one layer. It plays the layers against each other. That leaves the second half of the strike, and it's the real point. Why the rails? Why not just the front? Because the front is only the tip. Behind it stands a stream of shells, fuel, and men that has to keep flowing without pause. Or the pressure runs dry. That stream runs, as we said, on rails. And rails have a weakness. No tank has. They're rigid. You can drive around a road. You can't drive around a track. It lies where it lies, and it runs through exactly the nodes it runs through. That's why you don't have to destroy a single train. You have to hit the joints. Paralyze a transshipment yard, like Rotokovi, and everything waiting behind it backs up. The freight stands still. It can't be unloaded, can't be redistributed. Add the power outage, the plant near Zaporizhzhia, the substations that were hit, and the electric locomotives stopped too. 2 hits, 1 paralyzed system. And the term transshipment yard deserves an explanation because the lever is right here. Up to a node like that, freight rolls in large volumes on long trains. Only there is it broken down, distributed onto smaller transports, and pushed the last kilometers toward the front, often by truck because the tracks don't reach into the trench. When that point fails, you haven't hit a link in the chain. You've hit the place where the chain changes form. In front of it, the heavy stuff piles up. Behind it, the front goes thirsty. And now the point the headlines usually miss. In a night like this, Russia doesn't just lose fuel and a few locomotives. For a while, it loses the ability to move at scale ammunition, yes, but also troops. It's precisely that mobility that converts Russia's numerical superiority into real pressure at the front. Take away the nodes, and you take away its strategic depth. The rear, which used to be a safe reserve, becomes a bottleneck. And the alternative? Trucks. Russia can shift freight onto the road, and it will, but the road is no equal substitute. A freight train carries the load of hundreds of trucks. Trucks need drivers' fuel time, and they're slow, visible, and easy prey on the last kilometers for the FPV drones circling above the front. What flowed cheaply and invisibly on rail becomes expensive, slow, and dangerous on the road. The lever for what could come next lies in exactly that shift. That's the leap the SBS has made. It used to be scattered teams hunting individual targets. That night, it operated like a surgical instrument at the system level. Don't hit the symptom, hit the nervous system. Saturation to get through. Nodes to paralyze. Power to deepen the paralysis. 3 moves. 1 logic. Still, you mustn't overstate it. Russia has learned from 3 years of war. It has mobile repair brigades, spare parts, experienced patching tracks, and substations back together in days. A single strike, however cleverly executed, doesn't bring this machine to a halt. The decisive question isn't whether Russia repairs. It's how fast and whether Ukraine strikes again faster than the nodes heal. And that brings us to the real race. This war in the rear isn't a trade of individual hits, but a race between 2 clocks. One measures how fast Russia gets a node running again. The other measures how fast the SBS paralyzes the next. As long as Russia repairs faster than Ukraine destroys, it stays at pinpricks. If the ratio tips, if the strikes land more often and more precisely than the patches can be made, then the pinprick turns into a permanent wound. In that light, the night of June 7th isn't an event, but a test run. Can Ukraine prove it can hold this tempo? That leaves the question everyone cares about. What does this mean for the coming weeks? Here, I leave the ground of the confirmed and move to analysis. I'll put 3 scenarios on the table and then say which one I'm betting on. First scenario, Russia repairs fast. The repair brigades move and the substations get patched traffic through Rodakov and Chistiakov resumes within days. In that case, the night was a painful pinprick, nothing more. The front barely feels a thing. Second scenario, Russia shifts to the road. The nodes stay disrupted longer, so Moscow falls back on trucks. That keeps supply alive, but at a high price, slower, costlier, more vulnerable. Over weeks, what soldiers call ammunition hunger creeps in, not a sudden shortage, but a steady thinning at the sectors of front farthest from the intact tracks. Third scenario, the SBS holds the tempo. It hits not 26 targets once, but 20-30 nodes night after night, month after month. Then nothing fully heals anymore. The Russian logistics system is forced to rebuild itself away from rail toward a costlier, more brittle web. What am I betting on? On a mix of the second and third scenarios, not on the grand collapse. Russia will repair, yes, but it will be forced to move a growing share of its load onto the road, and that's exactly where the pressure starts to show. No dramatic front collapse, more like a slow strangulation. And here's an honest word, even though this analysis sympathizes with Ukraine, opening a window is not the same as walking through it. Ukraine's army, too, fights with thin reserves, with its own exhaustion, with a shortage of fresh brigades for large pushes. A paralyzed Russian node creates an opportunity. Whether Ukraine has the strength to use, it is an entirely different question. To leave that out is to sell hope instead of analysis. And here's the concrete condition the whole thesis hinges on, and by which you can check whether I'm right. If the transshipment nodes that were hit don't return to full capacity within roughly 72 hours, then the field ammunition depots on the southern front begin to thin out. And that opens a window, a narrow, precious window in which Ukraine could press locally with mechanized thrusts, right where the enemy's supply is thinnest. Why the south specifically? Because that's where the routes are longest and the lines thinnest. Ammunition for the southern front has to travel farther, over fewer nodes with less room for detours. What still gets cushioned in the densely connected Donbass hits faster in the south. When a node fails on that stretch, there's barely a second line to step in. That's where the paralysis is most likely to be felt, and that's where it's worth watching closely in the coming days. This is a forecast about a mechanism, not about a date. I'm not saying on which day something happens. I'm saying which chain is set in motion if the nodes stay silent. And I'll also say what would prove me wrong. If satellite images in the coming days show repaired substations and a normal train cadence through Rodakov and Chistyakov, if traffic rolls again as if nothing had happened, then this night was exactly what Moscow will claim. It was a pinprick without consequences. Then I was wrong, and you may hold me to it. So what does this mean for you if you want to understand this war instead of just counting headlines? Keep 3 signs in view. First, truck convoys. Replacing the trains on these routes, a quiet admission that the rail no longer holds. Second, repair crews swarming Rodakov and the substations that were hit the more frantic, the more the strike mattered. And third, a quiet local Ukrainian push in the south in the coming weeks right where the supply is stalling. If I'm right, you'll see at least one of those signs. Keep your eye on it, because the next strike doesn't decide a battle, it decides whether this night becomes a method or stays a footnote. If this breakdown gave you something, subscribe to War Room Insights. We don't sell you narratives here, we take them apart. And share it with someone who wants to understand the war behind the headlines.